Welcome to the Freedom For Ocalan Report. This is a programme produced by the Freedom For Ocalan campaign. The Freedom For Ocalan campaign is the UK trade union campaign to lobby for the release of Kurdish political prisoner Abdullah Öcalan as the first essential step towards democracy and a peaceful settlement for all the people in the region. As an international solidarity campaign, we believe international solidarity is all about understanding. So the purpose of this is to take the current news, the current affairs happening in the region, sit down with an expert and explain them to you so you understand the context and how they all tie together. It's really important, if you want to support our work, to like this video and subscribe to our channel. You can also follow us on Twitter @Öcalan3. If you're a trade unionist and you want to affiliate your branch or region or committee to our campaign, you can do that at our website, which is www.freedomforöcalan.org. And if you want to directly fund the creation of this content, you can go to our brand new Patreon, where for as little as the price of a cup of coffee, you can support the production of more content like this. I'm very pleased to be joined by Nik Matheou, who is an internationalist with the Kurdish Freedom Movement.
Hi Matt, thanks for having me.
Nik, obviously you're a very active organiser. What's the effect of the COVID restrictions, the lockdown? What's that meant for your organising work?
I think like everything else in the world, the COVID train, as I like to call it, came out of nowhere and really knocked us all a bit off kilter. There were lots of community initiatives, as well as initiatives that we wanted to start as internationalists and solidarity activists, that we had to either put on hold or radically rethink because of the COVID situation. But I think we managed to find some good solutions to that as well. So one thing that we wanted to do and that we were planning at the beginning of this year was to have a series of in-person cultural and educational seminars at the Kurdish Community Centre Halkavi in Dalston. And to use these as a way of doing more outreach about the politics of the movement, make more connections with interested people, with the broader left. And obviously that was something that we couldn't do. But one thing that we were able to do instead was a series of seminars learning from the Rojava Revolution and the Kurdish Freedom Movement, which I did as an activist in the Kurdistan Solidarity Network. And which was really successful. Over 5 seminars between May and June, we had over 200 people participating in the Zoom calls themselves, and then many more on the live streams. And because of the nature of the format, because it was online, it meant that we were also able to involve many more people from across the UK and from across the world, including friends from joining us from Rojava and from Bakur in Turkish Kurdistan. So there are definitely some opportunities that are presented by needing to shift formats as well as difficulties. But it's certainly been difficult. I know that in the community, in the brief opening, one thing that they wanted to be able to do more was educational initiatives on sort of weekend schools and things like this. And some good steps were taken towards doing that in the brief opening we had. But it all had to close down again. So it's been very difficult, but as I said, the format has allowed more connections, and that's meant also having some deeper relationships among ourselves as activists, being able to organise more closely with some people who you'd otherwise only see at those irregular meetings every couple of months where you come together to discuss and to report back. You find yourself actually organising really closely with friends in Scotland, in the north of England, and across the rest of the south. So it's been mixed, but I think that one thing we have been able to do is put ourselves in a stronger position. Hopefully, that when the opening up starts next year, and we can do more local initiatives. We have this experience behind us of running educational seminars in a really strong group connected across the UK.
So Nik, the first story I want to talk about is reports of the US Commissioner. So she's the United States Commissioner for Religious Freedom, a lady called Nadine Mainzer. She spent a number of weeks visiting the Kurdistan region, particularly northeast Syria, obviously known to the Kurds as Rojava, and she has had it's had quite a profound impact on her. This is what she's got to say: there is no restriction on the right to practice your faith. Part of the reason I wanted to come and stay for so long was to understand how they set up the government, how it works, and could this be something that other people can do in other places? So Nik, we actually spoke at length for one of the podcasts talking about the political system in Rojava, democratic confederalism, the political philosophy, whose architect Abdullah Öcalan our campaign is set up to free. This is really significant, isn't it? A US commissioner speaking in glowing terms about religious freedom.
So it's really great to see officials from the US coming over and making statements like this. I think it's not surprising. It's not as surprising as it is for the commissioner. To those of us who've been involved in the movement or who've known about the movement for some time, but it is an affirmation that. The project of democratic confederalism, democratic autonomy on the ground in northeast Syria is meaningful and is deep. You can't fool a commissioner on a weeks-long delegation with a series of Potemkin villages. There has to be real, meaningful religious and ethnic freedom to create this kind of impression. It's really good to see that that officials from the US will be coming over and hopefully bring that message back, especially to the new presidency and the new government in the US as it organizes itself. Yes.
And I guess you've got to kind of counterpose this with quite worrying reports that we're getting out of Turkey itself at the moment about actually, it seems like as a society under the auspices of the current regime, in a lot of ways, it's taking steps backward, particularly around religious freedoms and the freedom of women. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Turkish state has long prided itself on being secular almost to a fault, really, in terms of allowing freedom of religious expression under that. And the more recently, the regime has shifted this now to really reckless rhetoric around Islam and around claiming leadership of the Sunni Islamic world, and we saw this most especially in the last few months with the Turkish-backed attack on Azerbaijan and the unrecognized Republic of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, which ended in a somewhat capitulating peace deal on the Armenian side. Over that whole period, the Erdogan and the AKP, and I think it's important to mention the ultra-nationalist MHP party, were really drumming up anti-Christian rhetoric, and this is realised in terms of the practical suppression as well. So of Armenians, for example, in Turkey. So we saw in the last month nationalist mobs going through Armenian neighborhoods of Istanbul with Azeri flags, looking for Armenians. We saw this rhetoric also inspiring Grey Wolf, so this is the fascist paramilitary organization connected to the MHP, Grey Wolf groups in France to go on the rampage and chant, where are all the Armenians? So it's really, there's a really stark contrast here with the Turkish state and what's going on in the autonomous administration of northeast Syria. And one thing that connects this, I found out today in some of my activism around the Armenian community in northeast Syria, that the autonomous administration has just approved the application of a new Armenian council, the first Armenian council for autonomous representation of Armenian people in northeast Syria. So there's a really stark difference here. And in terms of women as well, this is really clear. The Turkish state, there's been a number of attacks on autonomous women's organizations, on feminist groups, and this is a yearly occurrence. The demonstrations for International Working Women's Day are always attacked in Turkey. And then on the other hand, in northeast Syria, you obviously have what's referred to as the women's revolution, the leadership of women from all communities. To emphasize this, the Armenian Council has an autonomous women's structure to it, as well as the Armenian Battalion, the Syriac Council the same. And so you really see clearly that these are two alternatives to the region that are being presented: either the leadership of a patriarchal, fascist, neoliberal Sunni version of Sunni Islam under the Turkish state, or a new region, a renaissance of the Middle East, which is able to encompass all of the diverse identities and genders which exist there. And I think just to connect it also back to this US commissioner, I think it would be great if there was more support to this political side of the project from the new presidency. A Biden presidency is in many ways a positive step for the autonomous administration and for the Kurdish Freedom Movement in Rojava. But in some ways it's a return to a more established status quo unless Biden changes the status quo that Obama had established, which was essentially to have a deep military cooperation and no political support. And this is unsustainable. It allowed this. It means that we really can't forget the role of Obama and the Obama administration in creating the conditions that allowed Donald Trump to then withdraw so quickly, more or less this time last year, and to create new invasion and occupations in northeast Syria. There has to be support, political support for the project on the ground, as well as support for the SDF, for the Syrian Democratic Forces.
So the next story, in contrast to that, takes us to Turkey itself. This is from a news site called Balkan Insight. So this happened on early on Friday, this past Friday. The Turkish police raided 108 addresses, and they detained 72 Kurdish lawyers, politicians, civil rights activists for their alleged role in the Democratic Society Congress, DTK. And so there's a statement here from a spokesman from the HDP, the Kurdish People's Democratic Party. Several lawyers and prominent civil rights defenders were detained this morning after their doors were broken by police. You, meaning the Turkish state, are killing justice and the law. I mean, the contrast with the previous story, Nick, I wonder if you can talk us through this.
I mean, as you said, this is depressingly familiar. The scale is relatively exceptional. It doesn't often get into the several tens at one go, but there have been lots of instances of that too. The broader context is that since 2015, when the peace process between the Turkish state and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, broke down, the Turkish state and the Erdogan regime began what can only be described as a political genocide of the Kurdish Freedom Movement in Turkey and the People's Democratic Party, which is, of course, pro-Kurdish rights, but also pro-LGBTQ rights, pro-Armenian rights. There's a member of parliament, Garo Paylan, for Diyarbakir, Ahmed, in North Kurdistan, is an Armenian. And for progressive Turks, because we shouldn't also forget that this isn't a Turkish-Kurdish issue. And since then, really tens of thousands of activists, of lawyers, of mayors, of co-mayors, of members of parliament have been imprisoned or forced into exile. This would be the equivalent of the entire core of the Labour Party, for example, and Momentum, and any number of local grassroots campaigns, sort of the whole of the liberal left and left-wing civil society in the UK being criminalised and put into prison. And it's really, it's reaching scales not seen before in the history of the Turkish state, which is really quite something, considering this history of the Turkish state has a number of coups that have encompassed imprisonment on this scale. International bodies have taken a stand against it, and particularly the sort of symbolic figure of Selahattin Demirtas and Fidan Yüksekdağ, who are the co-chairs of the People's Democratic Party of the HDP in 2015. But beyond this, there have been no real ramifications for the Turkish state. There's some discussion now of sanctions in the European Union, but they're largely driven more by the situation in the Aegean with Greece and in the Eastern Mediterranean with Cyprus than the situation of the HDP and the grassroots organizations like the Democratic Society Congress, which, to explain a little bit, the HDP is a broad collection of parties, a coalition of parties. It's not a single structure in the way that, say, the Labour Party here is. And then there are local parties that run in local elections. So there's a party called Democratic Regions Party in Kurdistan. And then alongside this, there's the grassroots organization. So the Democratic Society Congress, and then the Democratic Society Congress's autonomous women's structure. And there were a number of arrests, I think last month, of the co-chairs of this. So it's a consistent story, and I think what I really want to underline, as well as this broader context and the fact that the international community, so-called, has ignored this political genocide, is the fact that the international security regime is in fact complicit with it, because the anchoring of this political genocide is in the criminalization of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, of the PKK, which is, lest we forget, a proscribed organization here in the United Kingdom too. As I said, this began in 2015 with the ending of the peace process. So these two events are intimately connected. And it allows, the criminalization of the PKK allows the Turkish state to claim that what they are doing is imprisoning those who are members or spreading propaganda for a terrorist organization. So it's not simply one it's not simply a situation of silence on the part of the so-called international community, but of active complicity too. And in terms of the United Kingdom, this is very active. There are internationalists here who are regularly criminalized, questioned at borders, even imprisoned for association with figures who are defined or in places that are defined by the British state as connected to the PKK. And just to underline, the route out of this is to delist the PKK on the recognition that they're not a terrorist organization, but rather a party to an armed conflict. And it's on this basis that the highest Belgian courts, there was a long court case, the highest Belgian court ruled that the PKK is not a terrorist organization. So what we need is, as you mentioned at the beginning, the freedom for Abdullah Öcalan in order to be able to lead peace negotiations, and also the delisting and the decriminalization of the PKK, so that those negotiations can take place in a context of good faith.
Would you argue that current listing is it's currently acting as a barrier to peace?
Absolutely. It's acting as a barrier to peace, and it's acting as a justification for the mass arrests of HDP activists, of grassroots activists with Democratic Society Congress. There is. If I said that it's not simply one of silence but active complicity, it would be impossible to not be silent without getting rid of the active complicity. If you see what I mean, the moment that a government outside of Turkey begins to say, "Oh, you shouldn't be arresting these people," the Turkish state would be able to turn around and call them hypocritical and say, "No, these people are connected to the PKK," and all the rest of it. So it really is a massive barrier to peace, and there's no way to reverse this political genocide of the HDP and of the grassroots organizations without delisting the PKK and decriminalizing it. And just to say here, there have been some negative signs from the Biden administration that at least in this regard, potentially there'll be some sort of political support for the autonomous administration in Rojava, but there doesn't seem to be a change in terms of their attitude to the PKK in northern Iraq or the decriminalization of the PKK. There seems to be a continuing assumption on the part of Biden and his newly appointed Secretary of State that it is possible to try and deal with these issues separately, which it's not.
So just sort of coming back to the original story, is there, as we've said very clearly at the beginning, this isn't necessarily an unusual occurrence, it's a very sadly a frequent one, but it does seem to be ramping up somewhat. Is there a reason for this? I mean, is it related to Erdogan's domestic stability?
Yeah, that's the short answer to that is very so. The Turkish economy is doing abysmally.
Right.
It's at record. The lira is at record lows now against the dollar and the pound. It's definitely over 10. It changes every day, but it was at record levels at 7. So to put that into some context, the COVID crisis, it's very difficult to know exactly how many people have died because there's a lot of covering up going on in Turkey, but it's definitely very serious, and this is part of a long-term development as well in terms of the delegitimization of the Erdogan regime in Turkey. They are no longer able to govern as the AKP, which is why they need these ultra-nationalists in the MHP to allow them to govern with a majority. And it seems that maybe 30 to 35% of Turkish people actually support them now. It's only through mass vote rigging that they're able to continually maintain their position in government. And there's a presidential election coming up in the next year, so it does seem to be ramping up because of that. But I think here there should be a note of relative, I don't know, there's that Gramsci quote, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. The pessimism of the intellect is that this is ramping up and it seems difficult now to see exactly how we're going to get out of it. But the optimism of the will aspect would be regimes clamp down in this way when they've lost consensus, when they've lost their ability not merely to rule, but to lead. And certainly the AKP-MHP regime and Erdogan have lost their ability to lead. They've lost their consensus with society. And so all they have is the iron fist, no velvet glove. And so sooner or later, there are going to be more waves like the Gezi protests, and there will be some changes in the regime.
And so that's probably then the context for the next story that I want to talk to you about, which is, this is again from Rudor, and this is a quote from, he's a top advisor to Erdogan, Turkish President Erdogan, And this is in the context of, you mentioned Demirtas earlier, obviously detained in 2016, along with a number of other party officials and parliamentarians of HDP. But so this is a quote from Bülent Arink, is that correct? Pronunciation, thank you. And he's also the co-founder of AKP, and he's read Devran, which is a collection of short stories written by Demirtas in prison. And this is a quote from the co-founder of AKP saying, "Let everyone read Devran. Your opinion on Demirtas may change, but your opinion about many things like Kurds and their suffering will change. Kurds are among the oppressed in this country." Now, is this a sort of... Is this a Damascene conversion, or is this political theatre? What's...
No, I mean, I can't speak to whether Mr. Arink has really changed his opinion on Kurds. What I think it is certainly a sign for, and maybe a more cynical reading, is what I pointed to before, which is this decomposition of the regime, the Erdogan regime, and its hegemony. When very close advisors who still sit on the presidential advisory board are saying things like this, it's a sign that a political decomposition is going on, and a new composition is in the works. This already appeared in the last round of elections in Turkey, when I think she was from the MHP, a leading political figure of the MHP, split off and formed a party called the E Party, which means the good party, or the happy, the fine party. So I think the most cynical reading would be that that this is politicking, and someone looking for a way in which they can reposition themselves in an upcoming shift that's likely to take place in the dominant political figures in Turkey. I think the more hopeful and less cynical way of looking at it as well is seeing it as evidence of the strength of the HDP project under the leadership of Fidan and Selahattin, and the way in which the Kurdish Freedom Movement in general and all of its allied democratic and revolutionary forces have made it impossible to meaningfully deny the position of Kurds in Turkey, and that some kind of democratic recognition and a project for liberation is necessary. That is now a part of an emerging common sense, and so even as we've seen this extreme oppression, political genocide, we've also seen real meaningful victories that have shifted the political landscape, that make it possible or potentially even necessary for someone within the Erdogan regime, when they're repositioning themselves, to adopt this kind of rhetoric. I don't think that it necessarily means that we can expect Mr. Arink to lobby for Demirtas's release or anything like that, but it definitely indicates a ground shift.
And there is obviously historical context, isn't it? There's been overtures made to the Kurdish people before, particularly by this government. Yeah,
by the AKP. The AKP would not have been able to get the electoral results that it did over the 2000s and up until 2015, where they lost their majority, without the support of Kurds, some religiously conservative Kurds, but also because one of Erdogan's major shifts was to recognize the existence of Kurds. Now, let's forget, this had been officially denied for a long time, and actually the height of it was in the 80s, so fairly recent. That there were Kurds in Turkey. They were mountain Turks, and so the peace process was part of that from 2013. And there were already negotiations with Abdullah Öcalan from 2009. You can read in English the roadmap to negotiations, which is one of the first times in English that democratic confederalism was really spoken about in the translation there. The AKP opened the door to this. But when the historic achievement of the HDP in winning more than 10% of the vote, and so being able to enter the Turkish parliament as a party, because this is the proportional representation system in Turkey is essentially rigged. You need to get over 10% in order to be able to take seats as a party. So there had been independents before, but no one running on an HDP list. At the point that was achieved, Erdogan and the AKP attempted to turn back and turn towards the most nationalist party in the MHP, but they had already played their role in cementing the achievement of the Kurdish Freedom Movement in making it impossible to deny the existence of Kurds.
And before we move on to the sort of the geopolitics, you've already mentioned the conflict in Armenia and Azerbaijan. I do just want to just touch on, this is a story that's been brewing for a number of weeks now, and this is the situation in Shangal, which is predominantly a Yazidi, am I right in thinking that? And there is a ramp up of military, or the threat of a military intervention there by the autonomous Kurdish Iraqi state. Could you explain that for us, please?
Yes, I mean, this is a very aggravating, I think I'll choose, rather than depressing turn of events. So the long-term history of this, and I'm sure everyone remembers, in 2014, when the so-called Islamic State, Daesh, invaded Iraq from Syria, there was a genocide of the Yazidi in Shangal, or in Arabic, Sinjar. So people may know Sinjar as the name better. This was made possible by the sudden retreat of the Peshmerga, the forces of the Kurdistan Regional Government, which are drawn from two parties, the KDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party, and the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. And the KDP is the generally more dominant party. So all of the leaders of the KRG have come from the KDP, and not only from the KDP, from one family, from the Barzani clan, who have really dominated the Kurdish movement in Iraq since the 40s. So at the point that they withdrew, there was the genocide, and in response, and before the genocide had a chance to be complete and total, and Shangal city as a whole fall, the PKK guerrilla came to the defense of the Yazidi. And I really encourage people to go and look at news articles from that time, because you'll find quotes from Yazidi elders saying things like, only God protected us, God and the PKK. It was a really clear line that the party and the guerrilla knew that they needed to come to the defense of the Yazidi. From that, and also there was then humanitarian corridor that was opened by the YPG and the YPJ as well into Rojava for Yazidi to be able to escape. But I really want to underline that, because I think that connects to what I was saying earlier about the need to decriminalize and the need to delist. Then from that point, the guerrilla were defending Shangal and helping support the Yazidi to self-organize. And they founded their own defense forces, the Yebeshe, the protection, the resistance units of Shangal, and the Yezheshe, the women's units of Shangal. So there's again this aspect of the women's revolution there. And also for an autonomous council. So the movement never only has military forces, of course. Their military forces are there for self-defense, for legitimate self-defense, but also this self-organization, and the creation of direct democracy.
I think it's really important as well, just to touch upon the significance of having Yazidi women's protection units, because, of course, one of the horrors, one of the atrocities that the world witnessed, carried out, was really kind of under the banner of the misogyny of the ideology of the so-called Islamic State, selling women and children into sexual slavery, and the dehumanizing of the Yazidi people. And I think the fact that those people, in the face of that, and with the help of Kurdish allies and others, have developed that philosophy of self-defense.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some of the friends who joined these units were themselves escaped former slaves, whose entire family had been either killed or enslaved. So it's really one of the most beautiful stories of the resistance and then response to genocide that you could imagine. And so the guerrilla were there assisting with this process, and also they're joint with the KDP Peshmerga. It's important to underline that there was a lot of cooperation taking place at this point against the common enemy of Daesh. And then in 2018, the guerrilla left, so there is no PKK in Shengal now. But there are the autonomous Yazidi units and the autonomous Yazidi Council. And ever since then, ever since 2018, which, lest we forget, was also the year was begun with the Turkish state's attack on Afrin, there have been attacks from the Turkish state on Shengal. So there have been there was a targeted airstrike attacking Yazidi friends who were involved in the building of the autonomous administration in Shengal, and killing a friend named Zeki Shengal, who was on his way back from a commemoration of the genocide when the Turkish state bombed it. And that has continued. There have been, every so often, there have been military strikes up until this year, when there was an agreement which was orchestrated with the US. So again, we see the role of the US administration here, and the US administration's position on the PKK is really central. The Iraqi state and the Kurdistan Regional Government, with the Turkish state acting through the KDP as their proxies. And this is a pattern that we see across northern Iraq. Just this week, there was a deployment of KDP Peshmerga to a region which has PKK areas, and they did this with the Turkish Air Force as their as allies, like a joint military operation. So the cooperation between the KDP and the occupying forces of Kurdistan, the fascist Turkish state forces, is really close. And that's what we're seeing in Shengal. We're seeing a potential for the spread of what's looking like an oncoming civil war within the Kurdish region of Iraq, between PKK and the Yazidi forces, and the KDP, backed by the Turkish state, also backed by the US administration. So it's really aggravating that this can happen only 5 years after these forces were so essential in stopping the genocide from being even worse than it was, and creating this people's response, people's and women's response, which allowed new forms of life to emerge in Shengal. Aggravating is the only word.
Is there hope of a de-escalation?
There is hope of a de-escalation insofar as the KDP needs to be mindful of its own public. There are some people in northern Iraq who follow the KDP's line, which is that the only reason why there are any problems with Turkey and with the Turkish state is because of the presence of the PKK. But it's not the majority opinion. The majority opinion of Kurds in northern Iraq, in Bashur as it's called, southern Kurdistan, is that the unity of Kurds is more important, and that the Turkish state itself is the aggressor. That might not be enough. In the early 90s, there was a civil war where KDP and PUK, Peshmerga and PKK guerrilla fought. But there have been a lot of developments since then, of course. And if the KDP wants to forget the role of the PKK in fighting Daesh and in defending the Yazidi, then it's very certain that most Bashuri Kurds have not forgotten this role. And that they want to see unity between Kurds in Rojava, unity between the different political parties, and discussions of a shared political project. Now, this has taken some steps in Rojava, for example, where ENKS, ENKS, which is the sort of KDP affiliate in Rojava, and the autonomous administration have been having unity talks. But they've been stalled again under the auspices of the Turkish state. And ironically, in connecting again to Shengal and to the women's revolution and to the women's liberation aspect, one of the sticking points, which is just an attempt to throw up barriers to negotiations, but it's telling nevertheless, is the co-chair system. They're insisting that the co-chair system is done away with. So it really shows you how a shared patriarchal ideology, I mentioned before how the Barzani clan has really dominated Bashur, dominated northern Iraq as a very traditional patriarchal force, how patriarchy creates a unity between these different forces. They simply don't want to see the self-organization of people and women. They want to be able to continue their own exploitative and patriarchal social systems.
Which somewhat reinforces the political philosophy of Abdullah Öcalan, that, you know, to unlock all these oppressions, you first have to solve the first oppression, and that is the oppression of women.
Absolutely, and it again. There's the pessimism of the intellect aspect, which is that the strength of the response is asymmetrical to a ridiculous degree. Between the forces here of the Kurdish Freedom Movement, the popular forces, the women's forces on the one hand, and the Turkish state and global imperial powers behind them on the other, there are lots of reasons to have a pessimistic reading of the situation. But it's also a dramatic demonstration of the power of women's revolution. That they feel it is so necessary to mobilize to this extent, because they've seen what happens on the ground in Rojava, and on a smaller scale, but to no less powerful a degree in Shengal, when you allow Abdullah Öcalan's philosophy to be put into practice by capable and organized men and women on the ground.
So there's a really important story that's from the UK that I wanted to finish with, but before we get to that, I do want to talk about. It seems like Russia and Turkey are becoming something along the lines of regional power brokers, and I'm talking specifically about the conflict in Azerbaijan and Armenia. So the peace deal, which you've already referenced, it seems that this is a Russian, I mean, it's been widely reported as a Russian brokered ceasefire, but clearly there's quite key involvement from Turkey as well. And in fact, so Russia itself is very publicly supporting this idea that there's a sort of that Russia and Turkey are the regional power brokers with regards to this. Fyodor Lukyanov, who is a political expert close to the Kremlin, this is reported from The Guardian, by the way, and he's saying, you know, absolutely there is a new political configuration. What's going on here, and what is a Biden presidency going to do to that? Because obviously that's going to have an effect on US-Russia relations, US-Turkey relations, potentially Turkey-Russia relations. And how much, I'm interested to know, how much is this to do with Black Sea oil, and how much is this to do with what's been described as the sort of neo-Ottomanism of Erdogan's political project?
Yeah, so I think one thing to say at first, definitely, is that there is a common impression that the Russian and the Turkish states are opponents in the region, that they are regularly on the opposite sides of the fence. And to a certain degree, that has a basis. And you can see in Libya, they support different sides, also more especially in Syria. And to a certain degree, the implication is also there with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Russia has a formal alliance treaty with Armenia, self-defense pact, and the common phrase, or the ideological way of putting it in the relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan, is that they say they are one nation and two states. Now, that's not shared actually by all Azerbaijanis in particular, but that's the sort of ideological representation. But I think it's really important that while that has some basis, that we don't focus on them as opponents, because as you pointed out, they are brokers. They are going through the region and performing a series of partitions, or spheres of influence between each other, and implicitly, especially the Russian state obviously desires this, but also seemingly the Turkish state, implicitly also looking to exclude the US from the region and from having meaningful leverage and meaningful power in the region. And that's clearly what's happened in Karabakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh, in as the Armenians call it. There's been a coming together of their interests and a common plan for how to shift the situation in the South Caucasus to both of their benefit. I think so clearly the Azerbaijani attack on the contact line, as it was in Karabakh, beginning at the end of September, was given the green light in both Moscow and obviously in Istanbul. I think the Turkish state's interests are very easy to see. Throughout this entire year, the Turkish state has been engineering a crisis a month on different parts of its borders, going all the way back to February and March with the engineered migrants going to the Greek borders up till now. And it's really gone around all of the borders. And Karabakh is a particularly symbolic and ideologically useful crisis for the Turkish state to engineer. They closed their borders with Armenia when regions outside of because Karabakh is slightly complex, I won't go too into it, but the area that had been under the control of the Armenian forces there is bigger than the core area of Karabakh itself, which is really in the mountains. And so when those regions outside of the core area of Karabakh were taken by Armenian forces in 1993, the Turkish state closed its borders and started speaking about potentially some kind of pan-Turkic support for Azerbaijan, but Azerbaijan lost the war quite quickly after that. Armenians are also the target of really racist abuse in Turkey. There's people talk about having Armenian blood. For a long time, it might still be the case. You can't become a military officer if it can be shown that you had an Armenian grandparent in Turkey. Abdullah Öcalan is often referred to as Armenian. Armenian terrorists, the entirely defunct group Asala from the 70s and 80s is often joined together with the PKK in Turkish news. So they talk about Asala PKK militants. So anti-Armenianness is really central to Turkish nationalist ideology. So this would and has been a big win for shoring up support for Erdogan. The Russian state, on the other hand, it's perhaps less clear to people exactly what they're gaining from this, especially as what they seem to have lost is recognition that the South Caucasus as post-Soviet area is strictly their zone of influence. There's a kind of, in this New Deal, there's a recognition that the Turkish state has some role here. And I think here what's really important to emphasize is that Armenia had what's called the color revolution, so similar to Ukraine and Georgia and other post-Soviet republics. So a peaceful transition to try and make a break with the post-Soviet oligarchs who had been ruling the country since the 90s. And this brought in the current Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan. And Pashinyan was attempting to make closer relations with the West and to remove the power of the oligarchs who are always tied to Russia. And so the Russian state, which had always already been selling weapons to both sides, saw this conflict as a way to discipline the Armenian state, to discipline the Armenian regime, and to delegitimize Pashinyan in the eyes of the Armenian public, which they've done incredibly successfully. There's now a looming political crisis in Armenia, which has seen some opposition figures be arrested. Pashinyan is still the prime minister, but with the consensus around him has dropped. And in many quarters, he's seen as a traitor. As soon as news of the deal was made public, the Armenian parliament was stormed by protesters, and the speaker was beaten quite brutally in the Armenian parliament. So the Russian state has essentially achieved the disciplining of the Armenian state. There's no way that any subsequent Armenian government is going to look to try and separate more from Russia. It's also managed to put its boots on the ground in Karabakh, which it hasn't been able to do the entire way through the conflict since Soviet troops left in the early 90s and the war began. And they have also managed to diffuse a possible source of tension with Turkey by essentially agreeing a sort of carve-up, which has some Turkish presence in what are called observation posts. Also, there are now Turkish troops deployed to Azerbaijan, though it's not clear. There are some reports saying they're not in the areas that had been occupied or in the areas of Karabakh core. And then some other sources say that they will be. It's not very clear, but there are now Turkish troops on the ground in Azerbaijan as well. So there's a kind of defusing that's happened. And that's the same thing that happened in Afrin, which had been controlled by Russian planes. It wasn't the US present there. And it's the same thing that's happened with the presence of Russian troops in northeast Syria since the invasion last year. Now, the question that you had about the role of gas and oil, it's difficult to see exactly how this comes into it. But one thing that this does do is it opens a route through southern Armenia from Azerbaijan. That's one of the stipulations of the deal, which would mean a route for gas from the Caspian and for oil from Baku, which is obviously a big oil producing area, to go directly into the Turkish state, bypassing Georgia. And obviously Georgia is, and the Russian state are at odds as well. So yes, That's more or less the situation.
So does this is this almost like a pivot away from the Bosphorus?
So what it means is that we'll see more and more cooperation between Istanbul and Moscow, and the Turkish state acting independently of NATO whilst being a NATO member. Now, I'm no fan of NATO in general, but the hypocrisy of NATO in attempting to present some kind of coherent front in this kind of new Cold War, as they call it, at the same time as the Turkish state clearly has its own independent, and I emphasize independent rather than autonomous. They are acting outside and against the stipulations of NATO, and it seems that all that NATO can do is continue to celebrate the Turkish state. So we saw on Republic Day again, just as gallingly as last year, when it came in the midst of the invasion of Rojava, NATO making a big deal about the Turkish Republic and how important they are as an ally at exactly the moment that this so-called ally was acting unilaterally along with the Russian state to create a new humanitarian crisis, another round of ethnic cleansing in this region, and to really be act in a way that can only be described as against broader NATO interests.
So just one last, and this is one last sort of story about kind of the geopolitics of the region, and then I do want us to get to the UK story because it's really important. But I just wonder if this might be a potential kind of fracture point. This is from Euronews, and this is you mentioned the Aegean at the beginning of this program, but this is Turkey blocking the EU, I think it was a German military vessel blocking the EU inspection of a cargo vessel travelling to Libya. The assumption being this cargo vessel will have contained weapons for the conflict that is currently happening in Libya. So I wonder if you could just talk to us about that. And obviously we've already referenced NATO, Russia, Europe. So it seems that Turkey is either a belligerent or has a hand in conflict everywhere that it borders, including the Levant. So, which it doesn't border. It has an ocean between. Well, it has a sea between them. So, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So the background to this is since January, the Turkish state has deployed to Libya in defense of the government in Tripoli, which is in the middle of a civil war with a general called General Haftar. And what they have done is actually a foreshadowing of what they did in Karabakh. So in Karabakh and formerly in Libya as well, they deployed Syrian mercenaries on the ground, the same forces that had been involved in the invasion of northern Syria last year. They sent to Libya to shore up the government in Tripoli, and quite successfly. There was a chance at the beginning of this year that the government in Tripoli was going to fall and General Haftar's forces were going to win and end that civil war. And that's now clearly not going to happen because of Turkish state support. The reason why they did this was because they signed a exclusive economic zone agreement with Libya over the Mediterranean. So what that means is the area of sea that a given nation state has the exclusive right to exploit the resources within. So fishing rights, but especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, gas. There have been tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean since the discovery of gas around Cyprus. And Cyprus has been another consistent flashpoint in this year with the Turkish state. And so essentially what the Turkish state is doing is claiming a huge swathe of the Mediterranean as its exclusive economic zone and backing up the government in Tripoli in order to achieve that. Now, anyone with even a sort of GCSE level understanding of the geography of this region would find it a bit odd that the Turkish state here and Libya here would have exclusive economic zones that meet up, because there are quite a few Greek islands in the way, not least Crete. So this is clearly an aggressive act, and one that's been mirrored subsequently by the attempts of the Turkish state to do militarized drilling in the Greek exclusive economic zone around Castellorizo, which is one of the Aegean islands. So that's the sort of broader context. Now, the specific one for this and the cargo. So yes, they're suspected of carrying weapons. I think the response of the Turkish state makes it very clear that if they're not weapons, then there's something naughty on that ship that's being taken to Libya, that almost certainly under international law would be illegal. What's particularly striking about this story, though, is the role of the German state in blocking what I believe was a Greek what's the word for it? A Greek signaling of this ship and its cargo, and that it should be checked in EU waters. I'm fairly certain it was a Greek one. And so the German state in this instance acted as a proxy for the Turkish state. Now, that really doesn't augur well for a more unified European Union response to the Turkish state's actions in Greek waters. If the German state is willing to act as a Turkish state proxy, in this instance, it doesn't indicate that they're fully committed to their European Greek partners in their own struggle over exactly the same issues, which is the militarized actions of the Turkish state in the region and their desire to control the fossil fuels that are being exploited from the Mediterranean Sea.
So, quite a lot of distressing news there. We've covered a huge geographical area, so I just want to sort of bring this program home and bring us home by talking about the UK state. And this is, I think this is positive news. So this is the all-party parliamentary group, and I think stressing the all-party is actually really important with this. This has broad support from across the political spectrum in the UK, and it's the APPG on Kurdistan in Syria and Turkey, which is chaired by a Labour Party MP, Lloyd Russell-Moyle. And I'm just going to very quickly read this statement from them. Today, the APPG on Kurdistan in Syria and Turkey have launched an inquiry into the treatment of Kurdish politicians and Kurdish communities in Turkey. The inquiry is launching a call for evidence for both individuals and organisations to submit evidence by the 11th of December this year. And I just want to quote someone else who sits on that committee, and this is a Conservative Party MP, Crispin Blunt. He's the MP for Reigate, and he's saying, under Global Britain, the UK Parliament will expect its role to reflect the highest standards of democracy and accountable government for the world. Turkey is a NATO ally, and we have an obligation to be honest with our partners when we think they are turning their backs on fundamental principles of democracy. One statistic alone around journalists imprisoned in Turkey should give pause for thought. Does Turkey really imprison more journalists than anyone else? I think this inquiry could be an important step in asking if this government can be effectively held to account. Now, this is hugely significant, isn't it? This is a very important inquiry. What were your thoughts on this, Nik?
I agree. I think it's really encouraging. It's really encouraging, and I also agree that it's especially encouraging that it has crossbench support. Because as I mentioned earlier, this is now 5 years that there's been huge repression and political genocide of Kurdish politicians, journalists, activists, and just people on the ground. I think let's forget that in 2015, 2016, there were assaults by the Turkish military on cities in Turkey, in North Kurdistan, within Turkish borders, with thousands of people dying, including one particularly horrible situation where over 100 people sheltering in a basement were killed because of the curfews that were put in place there. So it's taken a long time to get to this point, and it's been through the support of MPs like Lloyd Russell-Moyle, but also others, that's produced this APPG inquiry, and I think it could be a really historic step. I mean, I have no doubt really that it will be historic because the evidence is abundant. It's abundant and it's everywhere. And it's only because of the geopolitical mess that we've been talking about over this discussion that it hasn't been recognized as quickly as, say, for example, the Rohingya genocide was recognized with Burma, or the crimes of Daesh were recognized as quickly. So the evidence is abundant and everywhere. But these kinds of steps within the parliamentary system are really crucial for getting the official recognition of what's happened, so that it's no longer just people like me, people in the Kurdish community, activists and journalists coming and saying to individual MPs, look at what's going on, but that we'll be able to point to a UK Parliament report that recognises what's happening and what's happened. And the potential coming out the other side of it is really potentially exciting. If, as I expect, the inquiry finds the Turkish state to be as violent and as extreme as it is, and putting all the blocks possible to any peaceful, democratic engagement from Kurdish communities and politicians in Turkey, then it opens up the potential to, for example, move motions to ban further arms sales or the sales of parts for arms, military support for the Turkish state. It opens up a potential to the decriminalization and delisting of the PKK, not as a prescribed organization, but as a party to an armed conflict, in the recognition that currently in Turkey, and not for lack of trying, there is no peaceful route to political engagement. And that doesn't mean that people don't continue to try, that friends on the ground in Turkey and in Kurdistan are constantly, everyone who puts themselves out there, anyone who joins any organization knows that they are putting themselves in for a potential imprisonment and torture taking place within prisons as well. I have friends who refer to going to prison as going to university, because that's how common and how much it's expected. That you go and you spend a few months there if you're lucky, and you spend a lot of time reading and having discussions. It is that common. It is that assumed. Imagine if every Momentum activist in the UK had to join and get involved with the assumption that at some point they're going to go to prison. It's really the scale there is really dramatic, but it needs some kind of official recognition. So it's really exciting, and I encourage people to follow it. I encourage people they can follow the Twitter account as well, which is at Kurdistan APPG. And I really encourage, if friends are listening who are journalists or who are community activists or who have done any kind of solidarity work with Kurds in Turkey, to get involved and to submit evidence, because it should be a really historic point in our struggle.
It's a hugely important step. So we'll be putting the full terms of reference and how you can submit evidence in the description of this video. I'm sure as well we'll be publishing them on the campaign website, because this is a hugely important step for the campaign. I should also point out as well, it's not just political actors, is it, Nick? It's trade. Obviously, being a trade unionist is arguably a political action, but trade unionists, civil rights campaigners, doctors. Frequently jailed.
It's really the full spectrum of civil society. Everyone you only need to name something that someone could be doing in civil society, and they've been put in prison for it. Lawyers, as we mentioned earlier, there's been this recent wave of imprisonments. Musicians. The group Yorum, two of their members were on hunger strike because of their imprisonment, and died this year on hunger strike because of the repression that they've been facing. Mothers of Kurdish activists who've been killed have been put in prison. People who are involved in cooperatives to make scarves like the one that I'm wearing, which was made in a women's cooperative in Turkey, they have been put in prison. It's everyone, and yes, trade unionists especially. So May 1st, as it is for the workers' movement across the world, is a big day in Turkey, and just like International Working Women's Day, it is repressed, violently attacked, and people are put in prison from it. So the scale of repression is up there with anything anywhere in the world right now, and really at any point in history. And given the role of the British state in providing legitimacy and support for the Turkish state's actions, this is a really, as I said, historic opportunity to try and shift that trajectory. Just like, for example, Saudi and Yemeni activists and communities have managed to achieve at least a change in the narrative, and I think a permanent change in the narrative about the British state's support for Saudi Arabia. They also managed to get a ban on sale of arms to Saudi Arabia, but somehow the Saudi officials still managed to get invitations to arms fairs in the UK. So the law can only take you so far, but it means that ministers are every time they appear on news, every time that they're interviewed, are asked about this the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. That's the kind of potential that we have with this APPG.
So, Nick, thank you. That was really interesting discussion. As I said at the beginning, it really helps if you like and subscribe to this channel. Follow us on Twitter at @OcalanFree. If you're a trade unionist and you want to affiliate to our campaign, you can do that at our website, which is www.freedomforocalan.org. You can also directly support the creation of this content using Patreon, and I'll put a link to our Patreon in the description as well. As I've said, this inquiry by the APPG, hugely significant. We will be putting the terms of reference in the description and all the links you need. If you or anyone you know wants to submit to the inquiry, you have until the 11th of December. Nick, really grateful for your time. Do you have any final message for the people watching this programme?
So the final message that I would say is that I have I've spoken a lot about reasons to be angry or reasons to be depressed in this discussion, but there are also reasons to be hopeful. We spoke about some of them with the self-organization going on the ground in Shengal. There are reasons to have that optimism of the will, and especially right now, when so many of us have been dramatically isolated for nearly a year. Many in situations at home where things are really difficult, and for rent, for family reasons, for all numbers of reasons, it can be very easy to feel hopeless. So I would encourage people to engage with the things that give me hope, which is the politics of the Kurdish Freedom Movement, the writings of Abdullah Öcalan, and the projects that have been put in place in Kurdistan and across northern Syria. As I said, we did these seminars earlier in the year, Lessons from Rojava, and you can go to kurdishsolidaritynetwork.wordpress.com to see recordings of those. Because I think what this politics represents isn't just a hope for the Middle East, isn't just a potential for a renaissance of the Middle East and a new Middle East that can really lead the rest of the world, but also the potential for us to build a free life everywhere. And as we look to come out the other end of this pandemic and the many crises that await us on the other side, ecological, economic, political, and all the rest of it, we can armor ourselves with this really beautiful and joyous set of politics and take inspiration for what we want to build here. So thank you.
Thank you, Nik. That was a really great way to end the show. Thank you for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again very soon.